Great. Hello, welcome. If you're just joining, we will get started in a minute or so, maybe a little bit less. We have a question on the screen. We'd love for you to respond in the chat. Okay. Then, Dan, maybe I will hand over to you to kick us off.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome, everybody, to Looking Back to Look Forward, Impacts of USAID's Withdrawal on Environmental Programs and Implications for a Reimagined Future. Today's event is hosted by the SID-US Environment and Sustainability Work Group. Thank you for joining us. I am Dan Moreno. I'm the Programs Manager of SID-US. Before we get started, I have a couple things to share with you all. The first is just, I know some of you are familiar with SID-US, but some of you may not be, so I did want to share that we are the largest and most active chapter of the Society for International Development, a global network founded in 1957. We serve as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together professionals from across organizations, sectors, disciplines, and career stages to exchange ideas, build connections, and engage with the issues shaping our field. We welcome both individual and institutional members with opportunities to participate in events, work groups, professional development, and a broad network of development practitioners and organizations. Visit our website for more information on how to join and other upcoming events. If you could go to the next slide, please. We did want to share that the views and opinions expressed today are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of SID-US, and we do not endorse any specific perspective, strategies, or advice shared during today's session. Next slide, please. Some things to note, this session will be recorded and shared publicly. If you need it, you can access closed captioning through your Zoom settings. Please let us know in the chat if you need assistance with that. And if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat. This is our first event where we're using the reaction feature on the Zoom chat, so some of you have already started doing that. But if you have the same question as somebody else or simply want to support or upvote somebody's question, feel free to give it a thumbs up or a heart. That way, when we get to Q&A, we'll know which questions to prioritize. So please react to the various things coming into the chat as much as you can, and stay engaged throughout the entire event. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I want to recognize the co-chairs of the SID-US Environment and Sustainability Work Group, whose leadership helped make today's conversation possible. Adrian Bliss is an environmental and sustainability specialist with more than 25 years of experience developing policy, technical guidance, and international standards. His work has spanned 30 countries and includes leading environmental and social due diligence for major donor-funded programs. Molly Hellmuth, our other co-chair for the Environment and Sustainability Work Group, is the Director of Climate Financial Risk and Resilience at TRC. She brings more than 25 years of experience at the intersection of climate risk, finance, and investment, and has led major climate initiatives for organizations including USAID, App Global, Windmark International, and ICF. Please thank me in joining Adrian and Molly for their leadership in the work group in today's program. If you could give them a round of applause using the Zoom reaction feature or in the chat, that would be great. They really do a lot of work for SID-US, and they are volunteers. So next up, I am pleased to introduce the panelists for today's session. We are fortunate to be joined by three leaders who are helping the conservation and climate community understand the consequences of USAID's withdrawal while developing practical ideas for future engagement. Monica Bansal is co-founder of One Earth Partners and a senior climate expert with 20 years of experience leading programs in clean energy, sustainable cities, transportation, waste management, and green infrastructure. She previously served as director of USAID Center for Energy, Infrastructure, and Cities. Hadass Kushnir is also co-founder of One Earth Partners and a co-founder of Reimagining Conservation. She brings 15 years of USAID experience across conservation, climate sustainable land use, strategy, and global portfolio leadership. Together, Monica and Hadass are leading the Momentum for the Environment Initiative, which is assessing the global impacts of USAID climate and environment program closures. Sean Peabody is Director of Partnerships and Innovations at Environmental Incentives and a co-founder of Reimagining Conservation. His work focuses on helping organizations connect lessons from the field with better decision-making, adaptive management, and future program design. Please join me in welcoming Monica, Hadass, and Sean. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. So here's our agenda for today. Uh, we want to talk about the conservation sector as sort of an example within international development of a sector trying to get organized and ready for a future opportunity to re-engage with U.S. government and help affect the policy and strategy in a future moment of opportunity. So we're gonna first hear from Monica and Hadas, who are going to talk about some brand new research that they've done and concluded about the impacts of the loss of USAID and what lessons are learned. And then we'll talk a little bit about this reimagining global conservation, this effort to get reorganized within the conservation sector. And then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. So first, just a little bit of framing. So on what was lost. So this is just a reminder. I hope this, maybe I should have said trigger warning. These are just a few headlines from a year ago. I'm sure no one here really needs a reminder of this, but this is the backdrop for reimagining conservation and us starting to get organized. So one of the things we like to use is an analogy of sort of a beach that is hit by a hurricane or a huge storm, and what is left is rubble on the beach. And I think that moment for us was last April, February, April, and I'm sure it was the same for many of you. Um, and the scope of this uh, uh, sort of you know event is hard sort of to imagine. It doesn't quite even really feel real. More than 95% of USAID's 10,000 staff lost their job. That includes thousands of USAID local staff who were the real boots on the ground with both technical expertise and then the in-country political connections that were really unmatched. About 85% of all USAID awards, translating to more than 5,000 contracts, were abruptly canceled. Specifically for us, this amounted to the loss of $1 billion a year in direct funding for climate and environment programming. And then all of this happened within a communications blackout. USAID staff couldn't communicate with partners. Staff largely didn't know what was happening themselves. Partners didn't have information that they could rely to their own partners in country and on the ground and to communities. Um, so really just a massive disruption. All right, so let me zoom forward now, and we'll talk a little bit more about reimagining conservation in a moment. Let me hand over to Hadas to talk a little bit more about this new research about what the impact of losing USAID's environment and climate program really look like and what lessons there are we can draw on for the future.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thank you all for making the time to join us. I wanted to start with just a quick note on why Hadass and I wanted to do this work. We started, we had this idea in February or March, right after the withdrawal, started on its very accelerated track. But something that we were worried about right away is we know there's tremendous urgency to our climate and environment goals. Climate change is accelerating, so is biodiversity loss. And for development practitioners, we also know that gaps and inequality are worsening at the same time. And then on top of all of that, these were all conditions that were in place before. We knew that the dramatic changes to the funding landscape would have direct and rippling effects across the whole field. We just didn't know exactly what those were, and we really didn't see reporting on climate and environment in particular. There was understandably a lot of focus on humanitarian assistance and health. So Hadass and I are here to tell you about the Momentum for the Environment initiative, which was made possible thanks to a generous grant from the Navigation Fund. The effort was also made possible by many people sharing their experiences, insights, and advice with us. And we see some of those people on this call today. So thank you to all of you. Are we able to advance the slide?
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. We are.
I'm gonna keep moving, Sean. And then
Just 30 seconds behind you.
yeah, that's no problem. So let me tell you about the Momentum for the Environment initiative. It has a simple purpose, which is to preserve and build momentum for urgent environmental action as we navigate enormous losses to the sector. It has two parts to it. The first is what we're talking about today, which is the post-USAID impact and risk analysis. There's a second part to it, which is a curated project pipeline that Hadass is going to very briefly touch on at the end. So for the first part, we did this analysis to do three things. The first is to document the implications of USAID's withdrawal and assess the impact beyond just the direct loss of funding. The second is to identify emerging vulnerabilities in the remaining funding ecosystem. And the third is to document lessons learned to inform future efforts to rebuild the system. Almost there. Okay, yeah. And then the next one. Great.
Yeah.
So USAID, this is just an overview of what USAID climate and environment programs look like in terms of funding. So direct programming totaled about $1 billion of annual investment, and it covered a very large geographic footprint, operating in more than 100 countries globally. Programs spanned a wide range of sectors, not all of which were tackled in every single country. When we're talking about climate and environment work at USAID, we're talking about these primary sector groupings. So the first is clean energy, which supported renewable power generation, energy efficiency, and low carbon transport. The second is natural climate solutions, which focused on the conservation, restoration, and management of high carbon ecosystems, climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction, biodiversity conservation of both terrestrial and marine biodiversity, including combating wildlife trafficking, and pollution reduction, which focused on outdoor air quality and also ocean plastic pollution. So I'm going to pass to Hadass.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Monica, and thanks, Sean, for running the slides. So this analysis is primarily based on semi-structured interviews with 150 key informants across 5 core countries, which you can see on the slide. We selected these countries to provide a representative sample of the different types of geographies where USAID worked. So we have a mix of regions and socioeconomic status. But all of these places are places where USAID was investing across the environment portfolio. About a third of our interviewees were US government and interagency staff, but the vast majority were locally based implementers and local community organizations, as well as some partner country governments and private sector actors. The data were analyzed using structured thematic coding, and to ensure that the interview findings were supported, we also validated them by triangulating them against external media scans, as well as a 175-person quantitative global survey that we conducted. So before we jump in, I just wanted to draw your attention to the color coding legend on the slide. Throughout the slide deck, you'll see colors that identify the frequency at which different themes were cited. So green is going to be a universal finding, so that means it's found across all of our country data sets. Blue is a dominant consensus. Orange means it's a regionally specific finding, and red is going to be something that has a lot of evidence in one location. Just so you all know, I assume you will know this, that we are probably just presenting a subset of our findings, given we have limited time. We are just finalizing the report and we'll have a full report out very soon, which we'll make sure to share through various mailing lists, including the SID mailing list. Next slide, please. Before we discuss the impacts of USAID's withdrawal, we wanted to set the stage and provide some context about how USAID operated based on the respondents' account of its programming characteristics. Next. Across the data we analyzed, it was consistently stated that USAID's presence in the climate and conservation space was characterized by unmatched financial scale, relatively long-term repeated 5-year project cycles, and a cross-sectoral landscape level approach. One example of this impact comes from the biodiversity conservation space, where we were told that investments contributed to a paradigm shift in which communities became active co-managers of the land and wildlife and derived economic benefits from conservation. A great example of this is coming out of Kenya, where 60 to 70% of wildlife lives on community lands rather than in official national parks. USAID with its partners played an instrumental role in growing the community conservancy movement from 0 conservancies to over 250 over the last 30 plus years. This came through sustained funding, which was used to develop umbrella organizations such as the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association and to support policy advocacy. This helped reform existing laws and gave communities a formal corporate platform to plan land use, manage wildlife corridors, and govern their own resources. Next. Another feature we heard about was that programs were typically implemented by on-the-ground projects teams staffed by local experts and backed by local U.S. environment staff. We were surprised to learn that most of our interviewees felt that USAID had a high-risk appetite and was considered more flexible than other bilateral funders. We also learned that USAID was willing to work on conservation in high conflict and fragile environments where others might not be present. One example of how this embedded technical presence was leveraged was through USAID's approach to localization over the last several years. While it wasn't perfect, USAID was making an intentional shift towards co-creating projects with and funding local organizations, either directly or through intermediaries. In many cases, this meant investing heavily in the institutional and administrative capacity of local NGOs, connecting these groups to world-class scientific tools and networks, and using the US government's convening power to give voice to marginalized groups, such as Indigenous people, women, and youth. So now we're going to transition, next slide, to the impacts of USAID's dismantling. We're going to focus on 10 key findings, and the first set is direct impacts on environment and climate progress. Next slide, please. So universally across our 5 core countries, there was significant evidence of backsliding in national policy frameworks, environmental standards, and institutional capacity. So this is the backsliding in governance, which means losing the structures that make project implementation possible. For example, in Bangladesh, we heard about how standard operating procedures to implement their co-management policy were fully drafted, reviewed by the Forest Department, and were sitting on the secretary's table waiting for a final signature. The withdrawal removed the external motivation required to push through bureaucratic complexity. And while things might still move, they're likely to move more slowly. We also heard about how decades of co-management progress were erased overnight in Bangladesh's Baikabil wetland. Soon after funding was cut, our interviewees informed us that the government immediately reclaimed control and cut off community access to the area. Numerous interviewees in Bangladesh also really lamented the uncertainty around the future of a critical mechanism that would have reinvested protected area revenues back into local communities. The mechanism would have really shifted the local power dynamics, but when we interviewed people back in January, the policy's future was still in question. Next slide, please. Another universal and direct impact is a loss of critical monitoring, transparency, and accountability mechanisms. What this means is losing the eyes on the ground and the monitoring infrastructure, which is leading to information gaps on the status of climate and conservation efforts and their impacts on communities. In Kenya, access to the climate data libraries and NASA networks, critical for forecasting and food security, were severed. This erased access to over 30 years of validated research baselines that national meteorological services across the region heavily relied on to produce accurate climate observations. We also saw examples of halted wildlife and environmental monitoring in over half our countries. In Vietnam, a respondent working to conserve a critically endangered primate noted that the abrupt halt in funding prevented their team from acquiring and installing camera traps and thermal drones. Without the specialized equipment, they were unable to properly survey the area to detect and document these highly elusive and heavily hunted species. Another thing we heard about, specifically in Peru, was how an investigative journalism initiative was wiped out entirely within a month of USAID's withdrawal. The initiative, which reported on complex environmental crimes, corruption, illegal gold mining, and the vulnerability of environmental defenders, was specifically designated to combat the lack of reporting in the Amazon, and it's now left the region back in an information desert. Next slide, please. So lastly, and I think the hardest for us to learn about, was the direct escalation of risk to ecosystems and communities working to protect the environment. Sadly, we were already failing to meet our conservation and climate targets, and now meeting them is going to be even harder as we're hearing examples of backsliding and increasing environmental degradation. Also very concerning is the fact that the people who are providing the frontline response, such as Indigenous people and environmental defenders, are under increased risk. Universally, across our 5 core countries, people told us about a resurgence of environmentally destructive practices and illicit economies. In Peru, one respondent told us about an increase in illegal gold mining and drug trafficking. He noted that unauthorized landing strips used for smuggling gold and drugs in the Ucayali region more than doubled after alternative crop programs were canceled. We, of course, need to be careful. Our research can't provide evidence for causal linkages, but we've heard enough of these similar stories that we think further investigation would be warranted to better understand the direct impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. Another really big concern is the risk of physical danger to environmental defenders. Participants felt that the withdrawal removed the powerful diplomatic shield and physical presence that previously protected environmental leaders, leaving them highly exposed to violent retaliation and harassment. Beyond these direct risks, withdrawal also meant losing the loss of support for marginalized groups. In the Philippines, the abrupt termination of a program that supported marginalized women waste workers inflicted a genuine emotional toll, as participants mourned the end of a continuous learning environment that had profoundly built their confidence and taught them their rights regarding gender-based violence. Next slide.
Thank you, Hadass. The next set of findings focuses on impacts to the resources and actions we need to achieve environmental outcomes. So these are the impacts to the funding ecosystem, partners, and coordination. Next slide, please. So we know that the pie is significantly smaller than before the loss, but it's getting smaller over time. In 2025, the historic 23% decline in global official development assistance didn't just come from the United States, but also Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, and France. Only 1.1% of our survey respondents reported that other donors have substantially stepped in to replace USAID support. This isn't surprising given the enormity of the loss. We don't expect this gap to be completely filled, but respondents widely perceived that when there was replacement funding, it was highly fragmented, short-term, and narrowly focused. This is likely due in part to ripple effects in the donor ecosystem, where multilaterals and other bilaterals went into a pause and quiet mode because their own long-term funding was in question. Respondents in the majority of regions also observed that planned co-investments from private partners and local governments collapsed, since USAID grants frequently acted as essential first loss capital or matching multipliers. In Kenya, the withdrawal broke agreements where county governments had already put in their first tranche of funding, but without co-financing, further investment was halted, leading to the abrupt loss of over $260 million in leveraged co-investments. With a smaller pie of resources, interviewees the shift created a hyper-competitive environment, making collaboration even harder than it was before, at a time when it's more important than before for them to collaborate. Next slide, please. Local organizations consistently, we all know this, they're the backbone of global environmental work, of global development work, but they now operate at a much reduced scale and scope and under more difficult conditions. To survive the immediate financial shock, implementing organizations universally downsized, resulting in mass layoffs, severe salary reductions, and significant brain drain as highly trained environmental professionals were forced to leave the sector entirely to secure an income. In Kenya alone, we heard that multiple partners cut 70% or more of their staff, and the remaining staff took pay cuts of up to 80%. Additionally, the abrupt, uncommunicative nature of the stop work orders forced local implementers to break signed agreements and promises with local communities without clear information on the reason. As such, in some cases, they viewed the withdrawal as a direct betrayal by the local NGOs themselves, which the NGOs had to then repair. Not only had NGOs lost the protective shield and stamp of approval of the US brand, but the messy withdrawal also fueled pre-existing anti-NGO political rhetoric where it existed, such as in Peru, where detractors used the moment to make baseless claims that local organizations had mismanaged funds and to lend strength to their legislative agenda to restrict the scope and methods of how NGOs work. It was widely noted that NGOs lost a needed neutral power broker, like in Bangladesh, where an important and powerful link between grassroots communities and their local and national governments was broken. Next slide, please. Many governments and organizations, of course, still want to prioritize protecting the environment, but they've lost access to the necessary technical support to take effective environmental action in many cases. Interviewees universally spoke to the loss of two primary resources: on the ground expert project teams that provided day-to-day practical support, and complementary access to world-class specialized experts from the US, which was unique among funders. For example, in Colombia, projects provided direct practitioner-to-practitioner knowledge transfer from elite wildland firefighters and carbon inventory experts from the US Forest Service. This loss left organizations and local governments without support to manage specific technical and operational challenges, prepare complex projects, and execute programs. In Kenya, this was noted, and other countries as well, as critical support to access and leverage bigger funds like large-scale World Bank financing, which is, I think we all know, very time-consuming and complex for partners to access. Next slide, please. Interviewees also universally observed that without 5 to 10-year project horizons, the sector has reverted to transactional short-term aid models. This is something we've all seen in the news at this point. Yeah, particularly for the environment sector, but I'm sure it's broader than this. Most of the problems that we seek to collectively solve are systems problems. Fragmentation leads to smaller, more isolated impact, making bigger goals much more difficult to achieve. For example, in Bangladesh, interviewees noted a drastic shift away from long-term proactive natural resource governance toward quick, reactive, humanitarian, and disaster responses. Respondents observed that donor coordination and existing stakeholder networks had fractured, risking more duplication of effort and a weakened collective voice to exert pressure on governments for policy reforms. The withdrawal also dissolved cohesive regional efforts, forcing actors to abandon complex cross-border initiatives, which are critical for environmental programming. Next slide, please. Unsurprisingly, activities and organizations with revenue-generating models were able to continue, but respondents observed that local NGOs were also pivoting to this model by transforming into social enterprises or tapping into investment markets. In Peru, respondents noted an accelerated push toward private sector diversification, leaning heavily on carbon markets to build alternative sustainable revenue streams driven by the corporate demand for carbon credits. In many cases, this is a positive move towards sustainability. But we did hear of the risk in over-reliance on this model, which can lead to the exclusion of work in non-revenue generating geographies and issues. Specifically, without donor grants acting as catalytic first loss capital to absorb upfront risks, we heard numerous cases of private investors retreating from volatile territories. For example, in Colombia, implementers noted that private capital is abandoning conflict-affected zones because the financial and security risks are simply too high to bear without a donor to de-risk the investment. Even in stabler geographies, pure profit models inherently bypass environmental issues that are low or non-revenue generating. In Kenya, participants working on reducing ocean plastic pollution observed that in the absence of external incentives, commercial recyclers were now prioritizing only high-margin materials while ignoring community-based collection of plastic that was specifically ocean-bound, but is more difficult to collect. The environmental impact stops being the driver. Next slide, please. The withdrawal of U.S. assistance for climate and environment does not just have environmental impacts. The thousands of USAID and project staff play broader roles that were critical to American interests. By stripping embassies of their on-the-ground technical staff, the U.S. lost its eyes and ears and its unique soft diplomacy. For example, in the Peruvian Amazon, the withdrawal removed the US government's only visible face on the ground, completely severing the embassy's ability to gather localized intelligence or engage directly with remote indigenous populations. As we've seen in the media, the US and other major donors are increasingly engaging in transactional development, such as exchanging life-saving health funding for access to critical minerals. However, practitioners warn that this top-down approach sacrifices authentic partner trust and ultimately squanders the long-term relationships that sustain U.S. global leadership. We also heard of the withdrawal directly ceding strategic and commercial territory to competitors. In Vietnam, the U.S. withdrew support for community forest governance in a region that holds the world's second-largest reservoir of rare earth elements. Without this localized environmental support, the forests are now highly vulnerable to Chinese-influenced illegal mining and exportation. Okay, last finding. Next slide, please. Everyone is adapting. It just depends how. After the withdrawal, there was immediate hope that there would be positives to the loss, like greater self-reliance and localization. But so far, in our research, we have not found that to materialize on a large scale. Few bright spots were identified in the interviews. Similarly, more than 80% of survey respondents stated that there were no positive adaptations or bright spots post-USAID withdrawal, or that it was too early to tell. Where continuation does happen, it's frequently described as heroic, sustained by volunteerism and fragile local alliances rather than institutional safety nets. However, there are some examples of adaptation that are worth noting. First, driven by an enduring legacy of human capital, local implementing experts dedicated to the continuation of their work launched new community-based organizations. For example, in Kenya, a former implementing partner established a spin-off NGO to sustain critical climate adaptation work in his indigenous community. Second, local governments in some cases were able to internalize capacity building and tools and scale activities independently using domestic budgets. For example, in the Philippines, a local government proactively took circular economy training modules, tailored them to their city, and formally incorporated them into municipal ordinances. Finally, capitalizing on market momentum, grassroots enterprises were able to sustain low-cost income-generating models. In Kenya, interventions tied directly to household income demonstrated the structural resilience to survive independently. Okay, so what does this all mean? Across every country that we examined, it's not great. Just what it means, it's not great. Across every country that we examined, the conditions for high impact environmental work have become more difficult. Governments have fewer tools, resources, and external support for necessary environmental policy action. Communities and civil society are facing severe stress from all sides, and they can't take as much action as they could before, even if they are still standing. International partners are operating with reduced resources and narrower mandates. And the private sector often needs a push into environmental ambition, but the donors and intermediaries who have historically done this now play a diminished role. The result of this is that the international climate and environmental community has lost ground. There's less ambition and less work being done overall on climate and conservation at this point.
Next slide. So we just presented a lot of findings on the impacts that can seem rather intractable. But Monica and I do have reason to be hopeful. People on the ground care about environmental action and they're not giving up. And we do see opportunities to maintain momentum. We can also use the knowledge of strategic gaps left by US withdrawal to give insights into how we think about the future. So to rebuild our global environmental architecture and to ensure foreign assistance protects both American interests and global public goods, we want to leave you with these 4 opportunities for thinking about the future of foreign assistance efforts. First, policymakers must not decouple environment and climate priorities from broader development goals. And development must maintain an independent, neutral agenda that is unlinked from short-term diplomatic pressures and domestic commercial promotion. Second, future assistance should prioritize stable, multi-year funding cycles and physical proximity. Maintaining long-term investments and embedded, culturally fluid personnel will broker trust in complex geographies, rebuild vital diplomatic eyes and ears, and offer a transparent alternative to the extractive models of authoritarian competitors. Third, to achieve genuine localization, policymakers can establish streamlined, trust-based funding mechanisms that right-size the bureaucracy to fit the partners and prioritize planning approaches that involve co-creation and adaptive management. The US should also help build resilient local institutions and incentivize international intermediaries to advance localization. Lastly, policymakers have the opportunity to deploy funding at a holistic landscape scale and to act as a central convener, wielding sufficient financial scale and diplomatic weight to design holistic programs that tackle transboundary issues. Next slide. Before we close, we wanted to briefly remind everyone about the work we did alongside this research to assemble a vetted pipeline of almost 100 projects stemming from terminated USAID activities. Monica mentioned this a little bit at the front, but one of the ways in which we seek to engage people in maintaining momentum is by providing options, concrete options for funders to have an opportunity to maintain momentum. The projects span USAID's global environment work and address a range of issues from biodiversity conservation to plastic pollution to climate resilience. Almost half of the partners are local, and so the pipeline provides vetted opportunities that aligns with our research recommendations. It's currently an internal database, and so we welcome anybody who is interested in talking to us more about these projects to get in touch. We're currently providing curated lists of funders based on their geographic and sectoral interests. Next slide, please. This slide just tells you guys how you're able to get in touch with us. We appreciate you for joining. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you want to hear more about these research findings or the project pipeline. Our report will be out this summer and we'll share it through the SID mailing list. And so I will pass this back to Sean to talk about reimagining conservation, and we'll have some time for questions after he talks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. It's really not my day today. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about reimagining conservation briefly. So we all just got bummed out and super sobered up with hearing about the impacts of the withdrawal of USAID and some fantastic recommendations. But how are we going to get those recommendations into action when there is a moment of opportunity, whether it's 2027 or 2029? This is the idea behind reimagining conservation. And we started just as a small group of folks about a year ago who were sort of lost in exile after USAID was dismantled and searching for other people who were interested in thinking about what to do and how to rebuild. And we were hoping we would find some organization that was up and running and that was getting things together and taking charge that we could just join on to, but we didn't find someone else doing this work. And so we decided, well, I guess we have to just get going. And so that's where reimagining came from. We have since then organized ourselves into two pieces. We've got sort of a core coordination team. We are volunteers. We meet once or twice a week. And then we have this broader coalition of folks that are joining us and who are on our listserv and who come to events. And we hope that if you're not already, you will sign up for our listserv and be part of this effort. A little bit more information. This is this core coordination team. We are former USAID leadership, including Cynthia Gill, who used to run the environment program at USAID. We are former implementers from Foundations of Success and Environmental Incentives and others, Stockholm Environment Institute, and One Earth Partners. And Hadass and Monica are One Earth Partners. And then this larger coalition includes, we actually just passed 500 people on our mailing list just last week. We've got veteran policy experts, national security professionals, private sector folks, advocates, and critics, importantly, and local and global practitioners, and hopefully you all. Our mission is relatively simple and broad. It's to build a bipartisan playbook that reimagines how the U.S. government contributes to global conservation, strengthening international stability and security while honoring nature as a core American value. And to do that, we're thinking and working towards a playbook, which will be for the executive agency team, wherever they may be. Could be 2027, 2029, I don't know. Hopefully not 2033 or something, but at some point, we truly believe the U.S. government will re-engage in international development, and a core pillar of that will be international conservation. And there will be some folks who will be appointed with getting this going. And if reimagining conservation doesn't exist, I imagine this is a similar situation in other sectors, that team will have a really hard time getting up and going because they will have a lot of pressure to do things quickly, and they won't have a lot of resources. And when you're in the government, it's very hard to convene folks because of rules, to convene people and convene organizations and sort of build a coalition or build a sounding board for ideas that you might want to do. So we need to do that first and pull that together into a playbook that would support them. And then we're thinking to organize around what the functions of what that international conservation agency or department or team would do, and to also organize around different scenarios, because there's so many big unknowns about who will be the lead agency for international development, who will be the lead agency for international conservation. Will they be staffing up and have capacity? Will they not? There's lots. And so we want to try and plan for different scenarios that might happen so we can be ready in that moment when it comes. In addition to the playbook, we are trying to build a community and improve connectedness within the coalition through webinars, networking events, and issue papers, which we've just started to release. We have a few out already. Issue papers are we released so far. One is on funding award size. One is on the role of intermediaries in international development. Another is on conservation as a core American value. And then we have more in the pipe coming on conservation and national security, conservation finance, and more. And then we're starting a monthly brown bag series called Conservation Commons. We did our first one this month, and our next one will be in August or possibly right after Labor Day in September. Well, we just have a moment left, so I think what I'll do is just pivot to saying thank you. First of all, Monica and Das, thank you for your presentation and for contributions here. And then I want to thank SID-US, Dan and Molly, and Adrian for helping us to organize this and to get this on the calendar and make this happen. I really appreciate SID-US for their leadership and continued work despite all the crazy times this last year, which affected SID-US so deeply as well. And also Wade Warren, who we spoke with a few months ago, and who was really pushing us to make this event happen. So thank you very much. I don't know, Adrian or Molly or Dan, if you have any closing thoughts.
No, I would just say, thank you to the presenters. It was a super informative presentation. I think we're all been looking for evidence and, trying to understand what happened. So it was nice, to get a stark look at the reality on the ground, especially the massive gap and ripple effect that left by the loss of $1 billion in annual investment in climate environment programs. But also, in particular, what I like about the activities and presented is the new initiative, which you're actively working on, and that is in the spirit of the Society for International Development as well. Is that how can we build a bipartisan collective pathway to be ready for global reengagement? So I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of this and hopeful that the momentum that you're creating continues to bear fruit and, maybe will translate into, a new kind of forward-looking reality of, re-engagement. So thank you all for your presentation. Really appreciate all the time and effort you put into it. I don't know, Dan, if you had something to say.
No, I think you covered it, Molly, and I just wanted to reiterate thank you, Hadass, Monica, and Sean, very much for your time and this very insightful presentation. Thank you all for attending today and being very engaged in the chat. We will be sending a post-event survey, so please do fill that out. Next month, SID-US has a member mixer, so if you're not a member, it's a great time to join. Membership is $90 for individuals for the year. And we have discounts for students and young professionals and retirees. So that event will be in person in Arlington, Virginia. So we encourage you to visit our website, learn more about membership if you're not already a member. Thank you to all of the members who are here today. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you.